During the 19th century, European societies would undergo a significant economic transformation that subsequent historians would label an industrial revolution. In typical accounts of this process, it is often claimed that capitalism and industry brought forth a middle or bourgeois class that would influence both economic and social modernization on a vast scale. This narrative has typically rested upon the idea that traditional societies, governed by social orders, were progressively replaced by a more dynamic understanding of society made up of socio-economic classes, whether middle-class business owners or industrial factory workers. Certainly, modernization did help create new classes, and these classes appeared to be antagonistic toward one another. During the 19th century, conflicts between labor and employers would arise and create very different social and political circumstances. However, recent histories of class have argued that we cannot simply see class identity and solidarity as a result of economic change. In fact, the very idea of class was linked to political changes and struggles that were taking place in Europe. As some scholars have argued, the idea of class itself was created through political struggles more than social change. In this respect, we need to consider to what extent post-revolutionary politics informed understandings of social change. To what extent did this period create conditions for inclusion and exclusion that would have implications for future social and political struggles? And to understand this, we have to understand what post-revolutionary liberalism was actually about and what it stood for. Liberalism was born from the French Revolution, but it also marked a reaction to revolutionary politics as well. Patriots and constitutionalists of the early 19th century often employed the term liberal to signify their opposition to absolutism and the authoritative power of monarchy. By the end of the Napoleonic Wars, the term had gained wide usage across Europe, indicating a brand of politics and political thought that supported constitutional government, individual rights, and freedom of expression. In this respect, liberals were neither reactionary nor radicals. They believed in the basic values of the revolution, but they did not condone the violence and anarchy perpetuated by groups like the Jacobins. Their political philosophy was summed up in a neat catchphrase: neither revolution nor counter-revolution. To this end, they supported what became known as the juste milieu, a happy medium between the extremes of absolutism and radical republicanism. Although a broad political philosophy, liberalism nonetheless had distinct traits by which it could be identified. For one, liberals supported the idea of legal equality. They believed that laws should be applied to everyone regardless of their social position or standing. On these grounds, they promoted an idea of citizenship that looked back to the ideals of 1789 and men like Sieyès. Secondly, they also supported a nominally free press. The press, in their opinion, was important to express opinion and inform the public on general political questions of the day. It was to serve as a counterbalance to Parliament, a place where educated individuals could express their grievances and opinions. In this sense, liberalism claimed to be receptive to public opinion and political expression contained within certain limits. It was in the chambers of Parliament and in the press, rather than on the barricades or in the streets, that political debate should take place. In promoting the idea of a juste milieu, liberals tended to associate their cause with a moderate and educated electorate. If liberalism was the political philosophy of the middle, its constituency tended to reflect the interests of a new middle class coming of age in the 19th century. Yet if liberalism appeared to be a political philosophy in its own right, there was a certain ambiguity to it. While conservatives defended royal government and a king, and Republicans would only tolerate a republic, liberals did not support any one form of government. Liberalism was a political philosophy that was adaptable. It could be applied to a monarchy just as much as a republic. In this respect, the liberal state was somewhat of a chameleon that was not tied to any one particular form. While liberals prided themselves on their moderation, arch-conservatives like Metternich and de Maistre hardly agreed. For them, liberals were a threat. Liberals supported ideas of constitutionalism and limited power, and this directly challenged the absolutist model. They also preached the doctrine of natural rights, which conservatives were loath to recognize. These things smacked of the Enlightenment and Revolution, those dangerous ideas that had reaped havoc across Europe. In this respect, by the end of the Napoleonic Wars, liberalism was branded as dangerous. Those supporting conservative governments believed it had to be repressed and discouraged. And so, after the Napoleonic Wars, liberal movements were aggressively driven underground. During the 1820s, liberalism was seen as a revolutionary movement. Liberals gathered in secret societies, they corresponded with one another across the continent, and in some cases, they collectively planned revolts against the absolutist regimes restored to power, as had occurred in Spain and Italy. Much as in Spain and Italy, in France, the Congress of Vienna had returned the former Bourbon monarchy to the throne in 1814. Louis XVIII, brother of the executed Louis XVI, had led a court in exile during the French Revolution, never giving up his hope of restoring his family once again to the throne. When Napoleon fell, Louis and his followers saw it as a window of opportunity. They immediately petitioned the Allies to restore the aged king as the legitimate monarch of France. Royalists celebrated the return of the traditional royal family. Naturally, those who had fought for the revolution or supported Napoleon did not. During the end of the Napoleonic Wars, as Napoleon attempted to rally people behind him in a last-ditch effort to defeat the Allies and hold onto his power, Royalists had clashed fiercely with Bonapartist and Republican supporters. Royalist volunteers and bands carried out a vicious war in the South, terrorizing anybody who had collaborated with the revolutionary government. As Napoleon's power collapsed, aristocrats were given carte blanche to take revenge on people who had plundered their estates or perhaps executed members of their family. All Bonapartists were purged from the local offices, imprisoned or hunted down. This pent-up rage held by royalists exploded in a veritable white terror. This wave of violence was troublesome for the newly restored king, Louis XVIII. While he did not sympathize with the Bonapartists or Republicans, he was not necessarily an arch-conservative either. Aged and worn down by years of exile, constant movement, and backdoor politicking, Louis wanted one thing. He wanted peace. As an old man, he wanted only to die on his throne, as he stated, something that his brother had been denied. And he knew that violence and senseless acts of revenge would not obtain this. Pragmatic, Louis realized that hardline conservatives would have to be curbed, and he surrounded himself with more moderate ministers who would work to secure peace in France. In essence, the return of the Bourbons would not signal turning back the clock on the revolution. The revolution had changed French society irrevocably, and Louis understood that he would have to rule with a constitution if he intended to prevent another revolution. However, the traditional pillars of the old regime, namely the nobility and the clergy, also had certain expectations, and they looked to the king for support. The church desired to have itself restored as the moral authority of society. The nobility, returning from exile, sought to have their property restored that had been confiscated during the years of the Revolution. These pillars of the old regime found their voice in various émigrés returning to France. Men like de Maistre, who held nothing but disdain for the Revolution and everything it symbolized. For them, the Revolution had been a movement led by murderers and madmen bent on destroying society and religion. These so-called ultra-royalists supported the restored king, but their support came with a price. They expected a Bourbon to restore the old order. From the very start, these ultras would be a thorn in Louis's side, often proving far more royalist and counter-revolutionary than the king himself. Yet this arch-conservative and counter-revolutionary view was not shared by all members of French society. The revolution had benefited some, especially non-noble groups, the bourgeoisie and the peasantry. Napoleon had promoted non-nobles to bureaucratic posts in his government, while peasants had gained land through the sale of aristocratic estates. In this respect, these groups did not see the revolution as evil and believed that its changes had been beneficial to French society, even if they didn't agree with the violence and anarchy that had broken out with the revolution. Taking his throne, Louis XVIII realized that he would have to balance these two sides if he wanted to retain power in the country. He tried to ignore calls for revenge coming from the ultra faction and put his faith in a young and forward-looking royalist named Élie Decazes. Decazes was observant to realize that the revolution had created distinct and conflicting political ideologies in France. There were conservatives who supported the legitimate authority of the king. There were liberals who desired a constitutional government. There were Republicans who wanted a democratic state. And finally, there were Bonapartists who supported the empire. Due to the ideological divisions created by the revolution, Decazes realized that any post-revolutionary government in France was going to have to pander to at least some of these factions if it wanted to remain in power. French government could not afford to define itself too narrowly, lest it invite another revolution. To this end, Louis accepted a liberal constitution. The new government setup had two houses, a House of Peers and one of Deputies. Peers were composed of the nobility and clergy, which embodied the spirit of the old regime. Deputies were elected through popular suffrage, thereby conceding to the democratic aspirations of the revolution. However, voting rights were only given to a limited number of property holders or those wealthy enough to pay a 500 franc tax, a sum beyond the means of peasants and workers, as well as a great portion of the middle classes. Under the new electoral laws, some 90,000 people were given the right to vote in a country counting about 30 million inhabitants. Louis intended to rein in royalist violence. Rather than hunting down revolutionaries in the countryside, royalists could now seek to redress their grievances through the House of Peers legally. Yet if Louis sought to appease ultras in this way, he also promoted some policies in line with the interests of the middle classes, encouraging limited economic interests and business ventures from which these groups could profit. The new non-noble middle classes were also permitted to defend their interests in the House of Deputies, ensuring that they had institutional channels to vocalize their concerns and defend their economic interests. On the whole, this balancing act worked, although neither side was necessarily happy. It did, however, maintain peace, and Louis got his wish. In 1824, Louis died on his throne, an unremarkable king in many respects, but one who had charted a path toward reconciling the old hatreds and animosities created by the Revolution. Yet Louis's death posed a problem for the future. Ascending the throne in his place was his brother, the Comte d'Artois, who took the throne as Charles X. Unlike Louis, Charles was hardly a moderate. He had been a consistent supporter of the ultras in his brother's court. It was well known that Charles had never accepted the French Revolution, nor did he feel a king should compromise. In planning his coronation ceremony in 1824, Charles revived the old traditional and religious ceremonies used by the former kings of France. He had himself anointed by the Catholic bishop and wore the traditional gowns of the absolutist monarchs. And this was a sign of things to come. Once taking the throne, Charles began scaling back the constitution. He imposed censorship on liberal-minded journals. He made blasphemy a punishable crime, stymieing free speech. His education policies catered to Catholic officials. Liberal politicians had been conscious of the growing royalist revival throughout the 1820s. Ultras had successfully used the chamber to punish liberals, often pegging them as dangerous conspirators and radicals. The fact that conspiratorial circles in Spain and Italy were fomenting revolt did not help, creating an atmosphere of suspicion that liberals found difficult to shake. In 1821, one of the foremost spokesmen for the liberal faction, François Guizot, published a pamphlet insisting that not all liberals were revolutionaries. In fact, he claimed, most liberals were men of principle. They were law-abiding citizens who supported order and good government, and therefore they should not be punished for the deeds of a few left-wing radicals. But such pleas fell on deaf ears, and under Charles X, liberals found themselves subject to police surveillance, censored, and harassed by officials. In their defense, liberals began mobilizing opposition to the king, essentially dividing French political society along ideological lines. And as liberals began winning electoral seats, the royal government became nervous. In July of 1830, Charles announced he was invoking his royal prerogative to dissolve Parliament and call for new elections. Liberals feared that this meant he was intending to abolish the Constitution altogether, prefiguring a royalist coup. In late July, these pitched political battles spilled into the streets with demonstrations. When the military was called in, a riot ensued. Paris was once again in the throes of revolution. Charles was not about to stick around in this atmosphere and immediately packed his bags and fled to England. With the royal government gone, the opposition officially declared the Bourbons illegitimate and set to the task of creating a new government. Upon hearing of the unrest, a small group of liberal politicians and journalists gathered in the Parisian office of a prominent newspaper and there planned a course of action. At the meeting, it was proposed that a junior branch of the royal family, the Orleanist line, should be invited to take the throne and establish a new government. As the prominent liberal Adolphe Thiers explained, the time had come for a truly representative monarchy, one that owed its crown to the people and, most importantly, to the liberals. To this end, an invitation was sent out to the Orleanist heir, Louis Philippe, asking him to come to Paris and serve as a constitutional monarch. Republicans, however, had a different idea. Tired of kings and demanding a democratic government, they reached out to the famous Marquis de Lafayette, inviting him to be the president of a new French republic. Lafayette had fought in both the American and French revolutions. During the early 1820s, Lafayette had played a key role in the underground politics of the Liberal International, corresponding with thinkers in Spain and Britain. His revolutionary credentials were impeccable. He was a near mythic figure for Republicans, a founding father just like George Washington, of whom Lafayette was also a personal friend. The problem was that Lafayette was an old man at this point. At the age of 73, he had no intention of heading a revolutionary government. It seemed that a new round of fighting was about to erupt between liberals and Republicans. And so to prevent this, the liberals took action. They approached Lafayette and asked him to give his public support to Louis Philippe, thereby winning Republican support for a constitutional monarchy. Lafayette agreed to do this for the sake of the country, knowing that his endorsement would win over Republicans. And so, a few days later, Louis Philippe and Lafayette appeared on a balcony before a crowd. Lafayette extended his arm to the new king. Louis Philippe accepted his hand, and the two embraced, draping themselves in the revolutionary tricolor flag. As calculated, Lafayette's endorsement won over the Republicans, and following this exchange, Louis Philippe took the throne as the citizen king of France. As he claimed, he would rule in the name and interests of the French people who had offered him the throne. The so-called July Monarchy, headed by Louis Philippe, marked a new phase in French royal government. For starters, it openly disavowed any attachment to the royalist faction that had backed the Bourbons. Instead, the government associated itself with a new group, the bourgeoisie. The July Monarchy pledged to represent the interests of this class rising to predominance in French society. In fact, Louis Philippe himself cultivated an image as a bourgeois par excellence. He dressed in plain clothing rather than royal gowns. He spoke about industry and business. He supported family values and bourgeois morals in public speeches. He also tied his government to the ideals of the French Revolution and the spirit of 1789. Church and state were separated, entailing that the clergy no longer had an unquestionable advantage in the area of national education. A new education curriculum was insisted upon by none other than the liberal François Guizot. The so-called Guizot Law would effectively sideline Catholics in education, continuing the policies of secular state education first put forward by Napoleon. The national electoral laws were also revised. Voting rights were extended to a greater portion of the population, bringing a wider segment of the middle classes into politics. The poll tax was reduced to 200 francs, allowing for more representatives to assume seats in the national parliament. Whereas some 90,000 had been able to vote under the Bourbons, new electoral rights were given to some 500,000, which was still a minority in the country of 35 million. Industrialization was also encouraged by Louis Philippe and his new ministers. Under the July Monarchy, a railroad boom seized France. Industrial ventures were spearheaded and banks began extending lines of credit. France effectively became an industrial power under the Orleanists. In 1840, Louis Philippe selected the seasoned liberal François Guizot as his prime minister. Guizot had been a member of the opposition under the Bourbon Restoration. His liberalism was clearly evident, and not just in his policies either. His entire outlook on society was informed by liberal attitudes. According to Guizot, it was essential that government be based on principles, not ideological interests or specific issues. For Guizot, groups like the Jacobins had favored ideological interests, and this had generated sharp political conflicts. This had to be avoided. Yet one of the principles that the new government reflected was a controversial one in many respects. It was the idea of natural elitism that many liberals endorsed. Enlightened and talented men, Guizot believed, would naturally rise to the top in a free society. They would earn wealth and social prestige through their natural abilities as long as nothing restricted them. This was precisely why the bourgeoisie was so successful in his opinion. They were self-made individuals. But Guizot went further. Because of their natural talents and abilities, the bourgeoisie was naturally suited for political leadership, he believed. This is why he supported a restricted franchise. Limiting voting rights ensured that reasonable and enlightened men participated in politics, and by this, he meant only those who could pay the requisite poll tax. This would effectively keep out the masses, what liberals often referred to as the horde or the vile multitude. The masses had been the one to empower radicals and men like Robespierre. They did not have the education or proper mindset to make informed and judicious political decisions. On the contrary, the masses reacted on instinct, and therefore they had to be kept out of politics. In fact, when workers and less well-off members of the middle class demanded why they did not have political rights, Guizot would respond with, "Enrichissez-vous," get rich, meaning once you got rich, then you could vote. In this respect, liberals were hardly Democrats, and they did not hide their revulsion for democracy either. Men like Guizot did not believe in abstract equality. Not everyone was equal in their eyes. Certain people, by virtue of their talent and education, were more fit for public life than others. This belief in organic inequality became one of the bases of liberal political philosophy. It was a philosophy that saw society divided along class lines. Prior to thinkers like Karl Marx, liberals were leading the way in an idea of class and class struggle. As Guizot and others saw it, class struggle was central to modern society. In their outlooks, liberals also argued that civil rights were not the same as political rights. While everyone might be equal under the law, they were not equal when it came to political representation. Here was the old division once again between active and passive citizens that had been raised in 1789. It was one that liberals actively upheld, favoring an educated and wealthy voter that had identified with the middle classes or the bourgeoisie. Liberals were constitutionalists, but they were not Democrats. These ideas were not restricted to France. In 1832, Britain would have its own bourgeois revolution of sorts. That year, a coalition of industrial interest groups and reformers banded together behind a new reform bill that would effectively christen the entrance of the middle classes into British political life. Traditionally, British society had been dominated by the gentry. This group had persistently blocked any mention of political or social reform. As many prominent Tories saw it, extending the vote would only dilute the hold of the old aristocracy over politics and policymaking. And yet, by the late 1820s, such attitudes were proving problematic. Unlike France, Britain had not been subject to a political revolution. Napoleon had never been able to conquer Britain, although he had certainly tried. This ensured that the revolutionary movements that swept across the continent were not as pronounced across the English Channel. This did not mean that Britain remained immune to the ideas promoted by the revolution. Following the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815, demands for political rights began to echo among various groups in British society, from the lowest and poverty-stricken workers to the new groups of entrepreneurs and capitalists who, under existing laws, could not vote or hold office. Capitalists in particular were concerned with their inability to shape policy. As long as the traditional Tories maintained power, it would mean that economic policies would favor agriculture rather than industry. In order to reverse this, they needed access to the levers of power, and the vote was the principal means for doing this outside of a revolution. Protests were staged, and occasionally these broke out into riots. Observing the situation, various British politicians and pamphlet writers began to fear that if political reform was not enacted in some measure, Great Britain would be facing its own revolution. The idea of reform had to be made palatable to conservatives. And to do this, pamphleteers argued that the parliamentary system had to be brought up to date, not necessarily revolutionized. Reformers claimed that industry and social progress had effectively created a new social group, what they did not hesitate to call the middling classes. These groups were not the aristocracy, but they were not poor workers either. It represented a new class of educated and enlightened individuals who were patriotic and sensible. The very idea of a middle class was telling. It signified a group that stood between the old gentry and the lower orders, a group that could even mediate between both and ease growing social tensions in the country. In calling for electoral reform, pamphleteers made the idea of a new middle class respectable and acceptable to conservatives who were loath to accept ideas about social change. The bill that passed in 1832 expanded the electoral franchise significantly, empowering a new non-noble group. It signaled a revolution of sorts, but one which many commentators claimed had not shed a single drop of blood. The reform of 1832, nearly coterminous with the new bourgeois monarchy in France, signaled the entrance of the middle classes into British political life. Whether through revolution or reform, liberalism was becoming the dominant idea within European government. Yet to what extent were these new middle classes a pure product of industrial change? In promoting ideas of political reform, writers and politicians aimed to dilute the power of traditional elites. To do this, they had to argue that times had changed, that a new elite was in the making, one that was worthy of holding political power and office. These new social groups were labeled as a safe middle or a bourgeoisie, effectively a non-noble class that was educated, reasonable, and had interests that needed to be defended. The middle class became the political idiom of reform, justifying claims for inclusion and greater enfranchisement. This new social imaginary made political change palatable, depicting it more as a product of modernization and gradual social evolution than revolutionary upheaval. It presented a new type of power and elitism distinct from ideas of birth or family lineage. Yet it was a form of elitism nonetheless, and herein lay the seeds of a new conflict.